from Romaine in sociology and GSD at Warwick. My research has looked at how climate aid has been recently subverted in the UK to now fund UK tech startups instead of global projects. How can we retain sight of progressive and just outcomes for climate change aid in light of today's everything financialization? So back over to you, Kesson, and anybody else, you can post questions in the chat too.
Wow, okay, that is a big one. I think, yeah, it is somewhat of a continuation of the aid industrial complex, right? So things that are labeled climate this or climate that, climate aid, often from these institutions in the global north are often not geared towards addressing problems that communities have identified or face. It's often about finding ways of profiting from some of those challenges and difficulties. And yes, well, one, I think that has happened in regular aid, regular overseas aid, for UK companies to be brought on board. And I think Emma Maudsley has some interesting work on this, on how UK aid is utilized to pursue certain neoliberal goals. Also, I think we also have the practice of sort of micro-entrepreneurial types of activities where, global capital is put to use in communities and in countries to do like small green projects and green initiatives, or what are called green initiatives in global south countries that actually leave more problems than they solve. I don't know exactly how could we address that problem without addressing the political economy underpinning of it, and that has to do with the who has political power and the kinds of power relations that affect these kinds of outcomes in countries. So I think it has to start there in terms of the kinds of social mobilization that is necessary to transform these kinds of institutional practices and the institutions themselves. And that can only happen with some sort of change in political power and happening.
Okay, great. So we have another comment or question from Peter. You don't mention the topic of corruption, diverting vast wealth away from economic revival. This should make a big difference to economies. So did you come up about anything in corruption, or have any views on that in regard to your research?
I do. So I mean, I've been asked this question before, and I think I'm practiced now with my response. So corruption, I am assuming the questioner is talking about either corruption in the countries, global south countries themselves, and how do we address issues, I suppose, around how do we deliver reparations in a corrupt country. That's how I'm going to sort of frame it, right? I think we can't wash our hands, especially those in global north and part of political polities in the global north. We can't wash our hands of what is labeled corruption in countries. There's a very much a Eurocentric idea about what corruption is in the global south versus what corruption is in the global north. And supposedly global north countries have good governance institutions in place. I mean, the pandemic has shown corruption is very much rampant in the UK, very much rampant in global north countries. We can't get away from that. I think the mechanism by which we deliver direct support to countries can be differentiated. So when I think about climate reparations from a practical point of view, it's not only or directly through the state that it's delivered. It has to be, we have to find democratic ways of delivering support directly to communities. And this could take a multiple number of forms. There are different kinds of democratic institutions like local councils, kinship type, democratic forms of governance structures at a very local level. There are regional sort of institutions as well in the Caribbean region that can deliver support. So we cannot think about it. I am not thinking about it only through the states. I think that would be a very narrow way of thinking about how support can be delivered to communities, and it would be sometimes very anti-democratic, where funds and funding gets caught up in existing political economic struggles in countries and not actually address those problems. So we need to think about it in multiple mechanisms to deliver support to countries.
Okay, so we have a question now from Goldie, I believe. Alongside the shift to a discourse of climate reparations, would you also have a vision for adaptability for the most vulnerable communities affected by colonialism-induced climate crisis?
Okay.
Big questions for you today.
I've taken my privilege as organizer to put something into the chat there.
Sure. I think so reparations in my view, and the report, the white paper I've written on realizing reparations mentions some of this, where it has to be targeted at different kinds of goals. So one, meeting the direct needs as a result of major kinds of disasters and compensating communities and countries for the devastation from climate-induced disasters. That's one end, but also more long-term kinds of support around building community infrastructures and building out community support mechanisms that can endure, because those disasters are going to be ever occurring and frequent. So we have to find ways of building those kinds of institutions and infrastructures, so that communities can outlast disasters and can survive their cultures, their because when there's a disaster like this, it has the effect of actually displacing entire communities, their cultures, their heritage, and so on. And we definitely need to focus on that long-term goal of ensuring that those communities can endure and their ways of life and meeting their long-term needs are met through a reparations mechanism as well.
Great, so we've got another question from Rethinking Economics. What is your response to yesterday's Das Gupta review with regard to economics and biodiversity and how it relates to your work. For example, the report outlines economic development and its relation to biodiversity since the year zero, but it does not mention the impact of colonialism. I don't know if you've read the report.
I haven't. I would be very interested in if Patrick can get in touch and send me the report. I've seen some discussion on Twitter, but I don't have full understanding of what was discussed. I mean, so the idea of labeling, and I think, and this, I mean, I gave a talk around how economics and how economics and economistic writing, going back to sort of thinkers, British economists like I'm trying, oh, I can't remember his name right now, but the person who wrote Principles of Economics. Why can't I remember his name? But anyway, I mentioned, I think, the idea that we consider nature as a form of capital is one that is very, very destructive to repairing the challenges around climate change, right? It's a very narrow view and a very colonial view from my perspective of how we consider nature. If we think about indigenous ways of thinking about nature and the kinds of socio-natural and socio-ecological relations, that have been devastated by capital, it is a very different way of thinking about how we can repair both human communities and how we can repair non-human animal communities as part of nature and as part of the environment. We have to find ways of challenging those kinds of normative considerations and very ideological ways of thinking about nature, which could be very destructive and actually reproduces the kinds of problems that I talked about.
Great. So I'm going to ask you the two next questions to think about them together, I guess. So one from Patrick Bigger, who says, given that a lot of what gets called private climate finance is every bit as extractive as other neo-colonial capital flows, do you have a view on if there are some mechanisms that are less bad than others, or are more commensurable with solidarity financing, or other ways we should conceptualize reparations that flow from the public or supranational bodies? So I guess you were talking about, ways of living with, indigenous ideas of nature, but what would be a middle ground in some respects about, what a reparation would look like if it's not wrapped up in that kind of financialization logic.
Mm-hmm.
And then just so that I can give you a bit more space to think, the next question is where this idea sits ideologically in respect to GDP growth and movements around degrowth, which links to those ideas you're talking about as well.
Right. So I think the way I can think about non-colonial ways of generating support is through mutual aid forms of support. I mean, if you read, there's an article by Audre Lorde, who is a poet and an intellectual, where she talks about the support that came after major hurricanes in the Caribbean. And, Caribbean societies have been used to mutual aid forms of sharing both resources, things like food, sharing after major disasters, sharing different kinds of resources that people need at times of disaster. I think that is the most organic way of how communities organize to form solidarities and share resources that are not corrupted by global capital. I can't think of any sort of international source of finance that do not reproduce colonial, climate change as we've talked about. I can't really think about any other international, I think reparations and what I'm calling reparative ecologies is one way of how we can think beyond those international sources of finance and private finance. Yeah. Oh, the other one was
degrowth.
Degrowth. I haven't thought about this very much. I mean, I know the argument. I know the degrowth argument. I'm not sure that they have grappled with one, the colonial orientations of Eurocentric thought on one level, and the growth comes from a European space and a European way of thinking. And I'm not sure, that it has really sort of grappled with the justice aspect of thinking about capitalism as a whole, and how do we repay what has been wrought by capitalism in many parts of the global periphery. I'm not entirely sure that it has done that kind of work, that intellectual work. From that point of view, so that would be my comment on it. Apart from, yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions from the floor for Keston? And I have one more question, just following up on the point you said that you said you couldn't think of any international finance that would be not reproducing the problems. And so, but then you also say that you want climate reparations that are quantified in monetary terms. So would that be like a direct transfer of cash, whereby local communities would have the autonomy to be able to decide what they do with it? Like, because I guess in some ways you can't have it both ways. You can't say, no, we won't take any of that dirty global capitalist money, because that won't even help. But then you are demanding the reparations in monetary terms. So I wonder how you reconcile with that.
Right. I think my concern is about how do we reimagine transferring resources, right? That go beyond aid, that go beyond sort of private capital or foreign investment and so on. So I think I'm hoping to start that conversation around how we reimagine and think about ways of transferring the necessary resources that do not contribute to the problems that exist. What I can tell you is that yes, it is, in my view, at this point, it has to be some form of transfer of those resources. It just would require us being very creative, and I don't think it's necessary in my role to think how exactly we're going to do it, because I think it's also a political question. existing in an academic space, I'm somewhat how should I put it? I'm not burdened with the political implementation of some of these things, but I think there are ideas out there by social movements and existing sort of communities about how those kinds of things have happened in the past and how they can happen to, you know, repair some of the damage that has already been felt.
Thank you. Goldie, do you want to step in then to make some closing comments?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kirsten, for really, I mean, it's a really rich presentation in terms of how you've repurposed and reinterpreted the data in the context of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, and a really long history of those kinds of disasters and dispossessions and extraction and so on. And I think what I really enjoyed about your presentation is also a kind of forward movement in terms of what you have done, but also where you're taking these ideas in terms of concrete kind of propositions, if you will. And I really love the phrase that you've just used for your work, reparative ecologies, because I think it has the two meanings of, you know, reparation, but also something that is as in something that makes amends, but also repairs and heals, if you will. So I loved that note, and really, we are all looking forward to where you're going to go next. Thank you so much for sharing what you're doing currently with us in terms of your research. And hopefully we will be following your work and seeing where it leads to as well.